Welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds, and thank you for joining us. If this is your first time, this is a live 30-minute talk show where we talk about topics that are urgent to leaders of mission-based organizations. We invite you to grab a cup of coffee and join the conversation. So if you are with us, please put your name in the chat or comment box and let us know that you're here. We usually get guests from all over the world, and we get so excited when we hear from where you're from. One thing we've learned in the past 17 weeks of our show is that the nonprofit sector has been hit hard by the pandemic. In my opinion, nonprofits are the fabric of our society, whether that's due to the much needed human services that they provide or things that we enjoy, such as the arts, camps for our children and after school program, training programs that make us better. And yet, nonprofits also share a unique characteristic. Many of them have to do more with less. They are chronically under-resourced. They can suffer from high turnover. And because of the pandemic, there is a chance that we may lose many of them. I am Cynthia Rojas, founder and principal of To Your Growth, which is a management consulting firm that specializes in organizational development, leadership development, and change management. I am here with my co-host, Peter Blakely. Hi, Peter. How are you?
Good. Thank you, Cynthia. How are you?
I'm good.
I'm Peter Blakely, and I am the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting. I help mission-based organizations measure and maximize their impact.
Yes, that's really important. We are also met here by our other cohort, Rebecca Tuttle. Hi, Rebecca.
Good morning, Cynthia. Good morning, Peter. How are you? Coffee time's on the road today.
I see you're in your car. How exciting.
I know. Just when you think the pandemic can't get any crazier, we are 600,000 without power here. So.
Oh, wow. 600,000. Wow. Okay. And we're still making it happen, which is the whole topic of the show, is how to get through this together.
I'm Rebecca Tuttle, founder and creator of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good. We help schools, nonprofits, organizations, and businesses find, write, and secure grant funding, and we teach you how to do it.
Awesome. Today's topic will be centered around a recent survey designed in collaboration with the Connecticut Nonprofit Alliance, the New Canaan Community Alliance, and the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, as well as Fio Partners. And here to discuss the results is Yurasek, managing partner of Fio Partners, which is a consulting firm that works directly with nonprofits on strategic planning, alliances, organizational development, and much more. Let's bring on Anne. Hi, Anne. How are you?
Good. How are you? Good morning. Thank you so much for having me on Coffee Time today.
Yeah,
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. The first thing we want to do is put today's topic into context. We already know that nonprofits are struggling. We've been doing this for 17 weeks and talking to leaders and have heard all kinds of information regarding challenges. What were you and the partners hoping to learn through this survey?
Sure. Yeah, so the survey really came out of our interest in understanding the status of nonprofits here in the state of Connecticut. As we had been sort of literally 4 months into the pandemic, we were certainly starting to see implications for organizations, but there was no cohesive sort of like pulse check of the sector here in the state. So if you were a funder, a capacity builder, a consultant, or even a nonprofit leader, it was how is everyone doing? And that was really the kind of origin story of the survey, was to really be able to do a pulse check on the sector.
I see. Cool. And you got quite the response.
We did. We heard from over 250 nonprofits. We just got about 258 responses, really across sectors and from across the state. In terms of the sample size, just about 42% of our respondents were under 1 million, and the other were over 1 million. So we have real interest as we talk about the results in that difference between smaller nonprofits and larger nonprofit entities.
Peter, do you have a question? So what we were
surprising findings to you?
Well, I want to talk a little bit about, I think, in some ways, some of the overall findings and maybe some of the surprises as well. I think one of the things that really struck home in terms of the results is this is not a one-size-fits-all pandemic. And so you have to realize that based on the sector of a nonprofit, its size, financial health coming into the crisis, has all in some way contributed to how the crisis has impacted the organization. And so when we really think about this, it's really about the fact that 46% of our small organizations indicated they're struggling. That I think is the biggest aha here. And in so many ways, when you kind of think about that in the context, that means that 46% may not make it through this process. And that's definitely when we really think about the power of small nonprofits and how they contribute to our community.
Yeah, that's scary. You went in a little bit in and out. So what you're mentioning, just in case people didn't hear, is that 46% of the respondents said that they may not make it. That's almost 1 in 2.
And again, it's that small subset, those that identified as small organizations.
Small organizations. Sorry. Okay, great. So that's one of the surprising parts of the survey for me. Sorry, is how differently the pandemic is challenging nonprofits that are under $1 million versus those that are over. I was a bit surprised by that. The challenges look different. And I wonder if we did this survey months later, would that flip?
I don't think so. I think in a lot of ways, what we have to realize is small organizations right now are focused on survival, whereas larger organizations are really focused on reopening, on trying to maintain safe environments for their staff and for their clients. Service delivery has been so impacted by this. In many cases, as you look across the survey, 65% of respondents are actually delivering services in a moderately or severely reduced capacity. Nonprofits are not doing what they're usually doing. And 5% of our respondents actually have already suspended services entirely. These in so many ways are indicative of the real devastation of the pandemic on nonprofits. But on the flip side, I will tell you that 23 respondents actually are increasing their delivery, while 7% held steady. Again, it's that variability of impact depending on sector and size. When you dig into this a little, it's arts organizations in some ways and educational organizations that have been most adversely affected as it relates to service delivery.
Yeah, of course, they cannot meet or have events. I think that that data point about the number of organizations that are offering fewer or scaled back services is especially troubling, though, when you look at the anticipated change in need in the communities.
Yeah. And I think in a lot of ways, the needs, they've been a bit surprising to our team. The first, really not so much. The most major need that the nonprofits in the community is really around basic needs, particularly around food security. What was surprising to our team when we dug into this is the second most identified community need is mental health services. And we've had some discussions that if we did this survey 6 months ago, there may be many other needs. Mental health, we think, would have been slightly farther down the list, not a very solid number 2. And again, I think that speaks to how the pandemic is affecting all of us across all of our communities, just in terms of the mental health, really, of all of our community members.
Yeah, I think that, Rebecca, you wanted to say something. Sorry.
Sure. So I want to jump back to something that we were just talking about a moment ago about the difference between the smaller nonprofits and the larger, because I was an ED during the last recession we had, and I saw a lot of my colleagues and friends close their doors. They just couldn't do it. And the difference, and I've also served in roles as development director, the difference is these larger organizations, many of them have someone like a development director, development manager who's 100% committed to raising those funds. So they're raising from a diverse pool of opportunity there. Whereas in a smaller nonprofit, it might be the executive director doing all of that fundraising. So I think the key to survival, especially if you're a smaller group, is taking action, constructive action now, and not kind of waiting it out and seeing what happens, but really saying, okay, you know what? The fundraising ways we once knew are no longer. We have to be innovating and creating today. And those are the ones that are really going to survive, and also the ones that partner. So partnerships are key here. I'm curious, Anne, did your survey touch on any collaboration questions or partnership questions?
Great question, Rebecca. And so first thing, I just want to reinforce your comment about the importance of board engagement for small organizations. They really view that as a critical concern of maintaining engagement with board and volunteers during this time as really a critical success factor. And then in terms of strategic alliances, absolutely. I think there is interest across the board from participants in terms of, can they get support for strategic alliance from external funding sources, as well as interest in professional development on that issue as well. We really see for the sectors that are most adversely affected that there's a huge implication for peer-to-peer support, but also collective work together. So arts organizations coming together within a region, or even educational organizations coming together in new and different ways. So absolutely, I think collaboration and strategic alliances are a strategy that we really want CEOs and nonprofits to be thinking about as they look ahead to the coming year.
Yeah. Another thing that I thought was surprising in this survey was, I think you mentioned 1 in 5 nonprofits think that they'll be in an executive director search in the coming months. I don't remember the time frame. Do you want to talk about that? That was shocking.
So we really also were really struck by that. So it's 1 in 5 respondents to the survey will currently be conducting an executive search in the next 3 to 6 months. So it's not like it's a year from now. I mean, these are successions and plans of turnover that are already in motion. And I think we have some questions about the why of that. Is it the stress of the pandemic? Is it baby boomers in some ways who finally are ready to leave? Or sort of like, okay, this is too hard. I'm done now. Like, I got my organization to this point. This pandemic has pushed me over the edge. I'm finished. Like, you need a younger, more engaged leader. That's not me. I'm moving on. Right? So I don't think we know the why of this. But I think for us, we are really concerned about the loss of institutional knowledge. Executive transition can be a very destabilizing activity for organizations if it's not done well. And so, again, this is another potential contributing factor and the fragility of the sector.
And another potential upheaval. One of the themes that we've returned to over and over is that in managing not-for-profits, it's not just about clients and community, but the staff itself. They are also affected by all of the stress of COVID, right? So their work has been disrupted, their home lives have been disrupted, all these change. Bringing in new leadership right now is troubling in an organization.
Absolutely. And I think, when you look at the leadership challenges that are raised up, absolutely, they're a little different for small versus large organizations. But for larger organizations, this idea of staff morale, staff burnout, keeping staff safe right now. I mean, these are, one of my colleagues used the term, the pressure on executive directors right now to manage what we're calling the calculus of risk, which is how at risk are my clients, how at risk are my staff, how am I keeping people safe? And that is an entire layer of stress that we certainly did not have before the pandemic. Executive directors stayed up at night worrying about a lot of things. Whether or not in some ways they were going to be infected by a virus was not on that list. And so this magnitude of, we do in some states have the ability to begin to reopen if we have low community transmission rates. People are wanting to be in person, but what does that mean? What's the stress and anxiety that a staff person brings to work every day to kind of figure out, am I going to infect my colleague? Like, the complexity of what CEOs and EDs have to deal with right now really comes through in the survey in terms of just the stress, the anxiety, and the potential of reopening and being in person.
And right
keeping
now,
your clients safe too.
Can I go to work and can my kid go to school? And we have to prioritize among those things.
And there's a deep concern. There's also really, to your point about childcare, it's a huge concern about staff retention, staffing shifts, the work from home educational models, which across any state remain unclear as we look ahead. Our first day of school here in Connecticut in our region was supposed to be in 20 days. They just told us yesterday, it's moving. It's not that day, it's another day. So, I mean, again, the unknownness of this just kind of continues.
You know, and this is really interesting. We started this show thinking we were going to talk about the pandemic, have some conversations. We were all going to get through the pandemic together, and then we were all going to move on. And so now in projecting,
be done by now.
and now in projecting future shows, we're talking about the domino effect of the pandemic, which is what you mentioned, this idea of childcare, homeschooling while leading, right? The mental health component that now leaders have to deal with, not only their own mental health, but that of their staff, which may or may not been the case before the pandemic. But Peter reminded me last night that Michelle Obama announced that she is depressed. And it's tough. It's tough. It's hitting everybody. No one's immune to this. So it's a really tough time. And I can't imagine leading an organization during this pandemic and never having met the staff personally and having to lead initially from video conferencing, where trust is built through one-on-one conversations and through time together. And when you don't have it, it becomes more challenging.
Absolutely.
Did you see any difference between the big and the small organizations in terms of that executive director turnover question?
I don't believe we did. I think it was pretty unilateral, kind of across both segments. We also didn't see any geographic differences. So one of the things we've been asked as we've shared the results is, did Hartford County different from Fairfield County? And basically, when you look at some of those overall data, there's really not a difference in terms of the kind of who's struggling and who's not struggling. I do think there is a sector difference, though. And so, health and human service organizations that have been able to pivot to telehealth models, where telehealth is possible for the teledelivery of programs and services, people are really able to, in some ways, retain some of those kind of services. And that's where you see increased demand and the potential for growth. But if you're an organization, we were talking with a colleague yesterday that has a dental program, like you're at zero because you haven't been able to figure out how to deliver dental services in a safe way just yet. So again, the variability in this it can really not be ignored.
We have a comment from May. I'm going to pull it up, Anne, and it will cover your face. So I'm just going to read it, and then you're welcome to respond.
Don't go away.
May says it's very unclear in New York. We have 3 models, and they all have issues. As a true person who believes that education is important, it's tough to convince parents to choose a model that she does not agree with.
Yeah.
I think she's talking about returning to school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the models is perfect. Yeah.
Did you have a lot of respondents, Anne, from school services or school organizations?
Yes, we did have a number of responses from educational organizations. I think one of the things that gets raised up in the community concerns part of the survey is this issue of education and working from home and what are actually going to be the implications for nonprofit staff. Here in Connecticut, we have 169 towns. And in fact, that means we have 169 almost different models of going back to school. So if you're an organization that has staff, kind of from across the state, you might have one person staff who's, their kids are in school on Mondays and Thursdays. Somebody else could be in school on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Someone else could be completely virtual. The variability here for managing a staff and again, getting people to come to work and or put our kind of kids back in school is really tricky right now. And I don't think that this is going to get easier. I think it's going to get harder. As in some ways, what we're talking about is if community transmission rates change, those tool models are going to change. So as much as in some ways we could sort of stay for a staff team, well, let's get the so-and-so schedule, it could change in a dime. And again, so when we're talking about the implications of the survey, we're talking about how do we continue to focus on flexibility and nimbleness? How are we helping people have empathy when they engage with their staff and with their volunteers? And how are we in some ways beginning to adjust our expectations? of what can we actually get done right now. So there's this real balance between we've got to do everything. We've got to kind of run around with our heads cut off, which I think we've been doing for like 5 months now. People are getting tired. And so how do we in some ways manage what's reasonable for our organization to take on right now? You know, are there projects that we need to kind of hold off on just because of our lack of capacity and or some of these unknowns? It's a really tricky time, that's for sure.
So what do you see as the opportunity?
Well, I think what we're also seeing is the opportunity to reinvent. One of the things that we are really talking about is what is the most important constant in your work? Is it a population that you serve? Is it a program that's really impactful? Where can we use this time to reinvent what we do? And that reinvention could include expanding our programs nationally. We're seeing arts organizations that have moved their local programming that was in person online. They're now drawing a national audience, not something that anyone would have ever considered. And that in some ways is the crux of what I think leaders need to be thinking about right now, which is how do I in some ways in this time of challenge also inspire innovation and invention? How do we really get comfortable with embracing this change, leaning into what's most important to us, but using this time and using it to, in some ways, potentially take a risk, do something bold, take that idea that a staff person had a year ago where you're like, there's no way we would do that. Do it. Now is the time.
Now's the time. You know, you remind me of the conversation we had a few weeks ago about innovation versus adaptation. And that, you know, adaptation maybe is what we've been doing the last few months, where we're trying to cobble together something that looks as much as possible like normal. But the real opportunity is to experiment and to say, given our fundamental goals and values here and this completely changed landscape, you know, now who are we and what do we do?
Exactly. And I think that so, you know, early on in the pandemic, we had clients who were saying, you know, I want to slow down our planning work. We can't plan right now. It's too hard. But what we're saying now is the time to plan. What are the things that are most important to us that we have to align leadership around? And that leadership includes boards, senior staff, middle managers. What's important right now and what are we going to really commit to in the next 6 months, the next year? You know, I understand that people are really not interested in saying, well, what's the world going to be like 5 years from now? But we do need roadmaps to kind of hold our teams together and to be clear about what those important things are. So thank you for that. Absolutely.
Well, PETA calls them a learning journal. Our show is sort of a documented learning journal. We've been talking about that a lot. And, you know, it's really important to reiterate as often as we are able for what our mission is on this show that, you know, flexibility is important. Risk-taking is important. Communication and leadership is important. All of that builds an element of trust to say, you know, because in my experience with nonprofits, having worked in them and now with them, you know, there's always been, well, that's not the way we've always done things. Well, those days are gone. You know, you can keep some of it and bring it along, but those days are gone. And so having that trust and ability to innovate together and try things that may not work. I think, PETA, you had said we were adapting, right? And now we've moved on from that. So having that flexibility is so crucial. And I think that's what's going to determine the organizations that come out successfully versus the ones that still come out, but they're struggling along the way. I really like these suggestions, Anne, and I think digging deeper into this data that you're showing us today or talking about is really going to help nonprofits understand.
And I think the other call to action in the data is really to funders. So leaders need to maintain the ship. They need to think about the direction and take care of staff. But funders have this opportunity at the same moment to do the same level of reinvention, to do the same level of reconsideration around how they are investing in and supporting nonprofits right now. I think what the data tells us in the survey is that intentional capacity building for the sectors that are most adversely affected is critical right now. If communities want their arts sector to survive this time, investment is needed. And how do we actually think about supporting sectors to be more resilient? What are the kinds of capacity building, whether it's professional development, in some ways that funders can really lean into at this time? And again, the call to action for funders is really around intentional capacity building.
I love that. I think it's interesting that a lot of the partners are foundations. And so it tells us how much interest they have in learning and hearing from the nonprofits. We all know what the challenges are. I think what's unique about this survey is, one, you got a huge response rate, and two, it looks differently depending where you're at. There's another data point that I wanted to mention, and I know we got a comment about some data. Rebecca, if you could look through that. But one of the things you asked respondents were, do you seem to be through the worst of it? And nonprofits under $1 million, 35% said that they are recovering, but 45% of those over $1 million said that they were recovering. So that tells you that there are nonprofits who are struggling and hit harder.
Absolutely.
And they're the smaller ones. So even though it's 1 out of 3, the fact of the matter is it's still less than those that are over $1 million.
And we really need to be concerned. Small organizations are the organizations that neighborhoods and community members trust. And it isn't the large players. It's the small food bank. It's the small after-school program where there are relationships. And when we lose those nonprofits, we lose the ability to support those families and those communities. Because I think it takes time to build those trusting relationships on the ground.
It's also a threat to diversity in the field. The smaller not-for-profits tend to be more minority-led and have more minority leadership. And so, particularly at this moment, when I know another one of the themes that really came up was nonprofits being concerned about diversity, equity, and inclusion, here is this massive threat to DEI.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I thank you for raising it. The other big takeaway in the survey is the interest of these nonprofit leaders for support around addressing diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial equity in their organizations. It was another huge aha. And I really, again, a call to action to funders to help really invest in that work and support organizations with addressing those issues in particular.
Yeah. So we're coming close to the end. And it goes fast. It goes really fast. And I just wanted to give you a chance and to tell us what do you want our audience to walk away with? And by the way, everyone, we posted the Fio Partners website down below in case you want to get more information about the survey. And what do you want people to walk away with?
Yeah, for nonprofit leaders, you are not alone. This is really difficult. If you are struggling, you are not the only one struggling. I think it's to know that nonprofit leaders you are just shoulder to shoulder in what is really dealing with probably one of the most challenging situations the sector has ever faced. And so again, I think for me, for nonprofit leaders, it's really thinking about that peer group that can support you through this, because this is not easy. And it's very clear in the survey results that organizations are facing really challenging times ahead. For funders, please just invest, find new ways to invest, be intentional about investing in small community-based organizations. And then I think for those of us that are in the field doing consulting and capacity building, it's really, again, how do we support CEOs and EDs in a really thoughtful and intentional way right now? Because again, these are going to be challenging times, and I unfortunately don't think it's going to end soon.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you. Peter, what is your greatest takeaway from today?
This conversation has reinforced so many of our previous themes that we've addressed, and it's been really interesting to see how our qualitative and quantitative research are coming together here. My big takeaway is this is not a momentary shock. It's not something that we can just adapt our way through and try to improvise. this is a fundamental shift in how the sector operates and manages. And we return again to that theme of going back to what is your most important value, what is your core service or the community that you are invested in and show up for, and reinvent how you show up for that community right now.
Thank you. Rebecca, what's your takeaway?
My takeaway is hold on to your mission. I mean, this is really the definition of your why. This is why you began your organization. This is why you serve people who you help. Hold on to that why, hold on to that mission, and share it with as many people as you are able, because you need a community to rally around. I hate to say it, the survival of your organization, and the community are the ones who ensure that you remain there and rely upon you. So hold on to that mission and hold on to it tight. And I have to say about philanthropists, they really are being flexible. I have never in my whole almost 20 years of fundraising and fund development seen this many grants come out with this much flexibility. So philanthropists really are, they are there with us, and we're so grateful.
And donors too. Donors have really stepped up and unrestricted their money and have given foundations the leadership to allocate the funds as necessary. So thank you. My greatest takeaway is two things. One is that the pandemic is not a one size fits all. That is really interesting, because sometimes when I think of things, I can easily categorize them. And so what this has taught me is that I need to be careful and understand how this is impacting us in a different way. And then the next thing is a term that Anne used called the calculus of risk, and how looking at risk has changed because of the pandemic. So that's really been a takeaway from me as well. So once again, I want to thank you, Anne, for being on our show. I know we could talk about these results for another hour. We are also going to bring funders to talk about how they're using the survey to help nonprofits so that we don't lose many of them. So thank you, and we'll see you all next week. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye. Thank you.